Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this side event on the landscape of Article 6 implementation, state of play, and key developments, which happens to also be the title of a study from the Climate Finance Innovators project that has just been released. There are a few copies around this room if you manage to grab hold of them. And so we are very pleased to introduce this latest study to you on the practical developments in Article 6. This is actually the third edition of this study. The last one was released in December 2020, so there are two quite important developments that have happened in the meantime. One being that, in fact, the Article 6 rulebook has been adopted in Glasgow. So we are now operating in a different environment. And the second development, which this study also focuses on much more than the previous ones, is that developing countries have started preparing Article 6 frameworks and starting to operationalize the mechanism on the ground. So before we start, let me introduce to you our agenda and discussion of today. So first, we will have a presentation of Stefan Hoch from Perspectives, who's the lead author of the study. So thanks a lot, Stefan, for walking us through the main findings of this joint study prepared by both Perspectives and Climate Focus. And then I'm very pleased to introduce to you a fantastic group of experts and panelists to discuss with us this morning, and who are actually key contributors to these developments in Article 6. So we will have with us on the panel Dr. Alec Muvondika from Zambia, who's leading expert on Article 6 in the country. And Dr. Muvondika is a researcher at the National Institute for Scientific and Industrial Research, and he also is a member of the Article 6.4 supervisory body. So welcome, Alec. I'm very pleased that Finella Awan is with us from the Global Green Growth Institute, GGI. Where she's heading the carbon pricing unit. And GGI, as you know, is a really key actor in supporting countries in their Article 6 readiness. And then we also have with us Ms. Vicky Janssens from the CLIC Foundation. And Vicky is General Manager at Southeast Asia for CLIC. So as you know, CLIC being one of the real front runners in operationalizing Article 6 and starting these pilot transactions. So also in our study, I think we covered the activities of CLIC already from version 1. So it's great to have you on the panel as well. So with no further ado, let me now hand over the floor to Stefan to introduce the study.
Thank you very much, Sandra, for kicking us off. Can you hear it like this, or do I need to be closer? So maybe. Is it long enough? Yeah, I think that's better. Because otherwise I have to bend down like this all the time. And I was already thinking all the time, how can I get this screen up so that you can actually see the slides? And then, Finella, I think you helped us out in a very pragmatic and efficient way. So thank you very much for that. Good. So this slide primarily serves to just, acknowledge all the contributions from a big team of authors. It was a big effort, and primarily we want to also make available, the link for download for you, because of course we firstly want to save the trees, and also the study is a bit heavy, so we couldn't bring too many copies, to be honest. But we hope that many of you will be able to access the link and download and dig deeper into what we are going to talk about today. So the study is structured into 4 parts, or into 3 parts actually. We begin by outlining where do the rules stand, but we're not, detailing again where exactly are we with Article 6. We're really looking at this from a practical perspective. What does it mean for practical implementation? What is being negotiated, both at the level of UNFCCC, but also now increasingly relevant, the Article 6.4 supervisory body for the new UN mechanism. And then in that same part, we're also trying to summarize, what we are finding in part 3, which is really the fact sheets. And then what we have observed to have become increasingly relevant is how are countries breaking down or translating the UNFCCC rules into the national frameworks. So we have a dedicated full section on this, so that the study doesn't only update facts and figures from the previous edition, but it really provides a deep dive into host country frameworks. And this is partially built on our research, but also on very deep and comprehensive engagements in many countries by the author teams, by both climate focus and also perspectives. And I think that is really a big value add, so to speak. And you can see, and I'll go into more detail on that, we are discussing trends and best practices, but also in quite some technical detail, like governance, institutional frameworks, and strategies and authorization requirements, etc. Good, and as I already said, part 3 has done comprehensive fact sheets on most of the relevant initiatives. And I hope you can read this with a light here, but the main summary, the key takeaway of all of these 3 parts, the synthesis if you want, is that, and that surprised us a little bit I think, is that the implementation of Article 6 has only slowly progressed beyond piloting, especially from the last edition of the study that we compiled now almost 3 years ago. And so we call this like a slow motion transition almost from Kyoto into Paris, and we'll go into a little bit of detail on why we think that is. The first important factor being that we just still don't have those rules. I mean, countries like Switzerland have clearly defined bilateral frameworks that are legally robust. I think that's very important for the success also of CLIC. But countries that don't have bilateral engagements or that want to explore other instruments, they don't have that. So on one hand, we are still negotiating some of the nuts and bolts of the Article 6 rulebook, how to actually do authorization, etc. What features will the registry have? And then countries have, to some extent, a natural delay into translating that then into the international agreements, into their national frameworks. So that has, in our view, created a lot of uncertainty and held up progress on implementation. And then, at the same time, we also observe that many countries have to begun working on that. While few countries are finished, many countries are working on developing these frameworks. And that is, in our view, really encouraging to see that countries are taking this serious, and we are really hopeful that more and more countries will become ready to have fully established the participation requirements. And we're looking specifically then there also on the interface between Article 6 and the VCM, which is currently, of course, very important. We observe also that a number of buyer initiatives from the global south have been increasing. That is really important also in terms of diversifying demand. It is not only Korea, it is also, UAE, even where we are right now, and also other countries. So that is encouraging. We do think once this regulatory clarity has increased, a lot of the demand may be accelerated, but the really important additional factor, the last one here, is of course also that the demand signals really need to increase and become stronger for implementation to pick up, and that is of course directly linked to ambition. So just quickly, this is now showing you the structure of part 1. And we are looking first, as I already said, quickly at, where do we stand from a practitioner perspective on the status of UNFCCC rules. And then in chapter 3 of the study, we summarize the progress on Article 6 implementation based on the fact sheets. On the rules, we are looking now for the first time also in detail on the new mechanism, because the short summary is that from a regulatory point of view, at the level of the 6.4 supervisory body, the mechanism is now ready to go. And I think what we need to really kick this into implementation mode is now, let's say, the agreement by parties, by the CMA essentially, or by SABSTA, you could say, to accept those regulatory standards. And then we'll have a new UN mechanism again next year, and that will be a game changer in a certain way. Then we have, as I said, in part 3 also elaborated in great detail facts and figures. And just to quickly go into slightly more detail here, we'll not elaborate on the details here, don't worry, but we distinguish between 6.2 and 6.4. Of course, 6.8 is very relevant, the non-market approaches, but here we really focus on the carbon market, so we have left that out. And this table actually is summarizing, what was left and what will be the next steps after the last COP. And while we call this the nuts and bolts because it's very technical, it's important to recognize that only some of these things are being discussed here. Others are actually scheduled already for the next COP only. So, for instance, the important corresponding adjustments. And that means we'll be in a continuous process of further evolution of the rules, and that will, not be finalized after this COP. I think many of those issues are important and will be discussed on the agenda this COP, and we hope that further improvement on the rules can be found, and I think we are quite optimistic about that because the spirit is, I think, overall really from a bird's eye view constructive and focused on finding solutions, so that is good to note. And so we are quite positive that we'll make one or several steps forward, but it will not be the end of the journey in terms of finalizing the rules. 4.6.2. 4.6.4, it's slightly different because most of the open issues are discussed at this COP. There's nothing major, I would say, that we need to wait for the next COP. There is one issue that is creating, let's say, some issues, and that is the methodological guidance on removals. So that is very clear, but we also think that as part of the package that will go forward and then can continually be improved over time. And in our view, at least in my personal view, this is, I think, the right approach because delaying the start of the mechanism for another year would really not send a good signal. So here we are really quite optimistic that the new mechanism will see life next year. So this is one of the visualizations then, of everything we found in the fact sheets, what has now established itself quite nicely, what we are using in a lot of presentations, the global overview of where we stand now with Article 6 implementation. And you see in this dotted legend at the bottom, you see the various instruments. I will not go into much detail now, but just for instance, the green one is the Japanese mechanism, and light blue is Sweden, and then we have in purple the Swiss activities, Swiss supported activities and bilateral agreements. So you can see there's a relatively well-balanced picture geographically. We continue to see what we noted already in the last or previous editions of the study, that there's strong participation of African countries, which was a big concern at the beginning of the Kyoto mechanism implementation phase. So we continue to see a well-balanced, if slow, progress towards implementation. We think this is quite important for the overall legitimacy of the mechanism, or of the range of mechanisms. And as I said already in the beginning, now this gives you the timeline, sort of where the different instruments come in. I think I will also not, explain this in detail now to save some time also for the discussion. But it's interesting to see if you look at the end of the timeline. As I said, there's new entrants, although in the international buyer space, that are coming from the global south. One could, of course, imply here where's the demand from the global north. That should actually also increase its demand signal, in our view at least. That is not forthcoming as much, although Australia is here the notable exception, which is good. But yeah. Yeah, I think the other points we've already made sufficiently clear that a lot of these pilots have faced some challenges also in country frameworks and so on. We'll get into that more. What I personally found, frankly, a little bit disappointing, that the overall aggregated number of investments that we saw now compared to the last edition several years ago has not substantially increased, and that is one of the key indicators, that we now see to deduce that conclusion that progress has been disappointingly slow in some way. You will see here in the outer circle, the smaller ones, the financial figures, at least that are publicly available. So we're not claiming this is the absolute truth. It is the best available public knowledge. And I think there are, some additional figures that we couldn't now access. That is clear, to be transparent here also on some of the methodological, let's say, constraints, but the overall message doesn't change. Whether there's another 100 million here or there, I think that doesn't change the big picture message that Article 6 has not yet begun to mobilize the investments that we need to see to really get, a transformation in major emitting countries. And so the conclusions on the first part, we do see the regulatory developments concerning the operationalization of the A64 mechanism as a key potential progress now moving forward, but also the alignment of the independent crediting standards, the voluntary carbon market standards like Gold Standard and Vera, may quite possibly accelerate ITMO transaction volumes in the short term. That means once countries are ready to provide authorizations also for VCM-based units that are authorized, I think that may accelerate ITMO volumes quite significantly in the short term. And that is then a function of what we're going to talk about in the next part. Article 6 activities are quite strongly linked with capacity building programs, and we hope also that the transition of some of the good CDM activities that meet all the participation requirements will basically provide a fast start for the new mechanism, which I think is also not something that has been well understood and appreciated. Good. So now, moving to the second part, you see here the list of countries that we have analyzed by region. So it was quite a large number of countries that are at various levels of developing their Article 6 frameworks. And here we are then categorizing Article 6 in these blocks, so to speak. So we're looking at what does the Article 6 strategy look like, what is the legal framework and governance, the technical framework and infrastructure, as well as capacity building. So these are sort of major building blocks of Article 6 readiness. And I think, on strategy, we see that there are different approaches. Most of them are aligned with the NDC, which is a good thing. On the legal framework especially, we see few countries that are actually really achieving, the status of having a legal framework in place, but many of them are working towards that. That is very important. And then in terms of institutional framework, clearly allocating responsibilities is something that's really important that needs to focus on. I'll move forward so that we keep enough time for the discussion. And I think we are primarily providing some examples of frontrunners. So Zambia, Fiji, Ghana, a country that many people are talking about, but also others that are not so much on the radar of the international discussion, like Jordan, for instance, are making important progress now on establishing their Article 6 participation requirements. That also specifically talks about authorization of ITMOs, for instance. So overall, we are still at early stage in many countries, but as I already mentioned, this is to some extent a natural delay occurring from the, at least in the big picture since Paris, slow progress in agreeing on the Article 6 rulebook, but we're quite confident this will accelerate quite significantly. Then you see here the common elements in all the Article 6 frameworks. Again, I cannot go into much detail now, but just to give you a sense of what is in the study. So most or all countries are looking at national registries on approval procedures and eligibility criteria for selecting activities, many procedures need to be established for then also, accounting and reporting frameworks, etc. Fee structures is something really important where there's not a lot of precedent from CDM in the Kyoto times, and that has actually also expanded to benefit sharing by now. We'll get to that. Infrastructure is an important one, as well as more broadly the institutional arrangements. On authorization, what we find that many countries, while there is no singular approach, many countries have defined positive and some even negative lists. A lot of countries are looking at abatement costs, on baselines, on sustainable development impacts. It's more or less what you would expect, I think. But the important innovations, so to say, that are required out of the Article 6 rulebook is, for instance, this point about conservative baselines, where we cannot just use the BAU anymore, we have to think about new ways, and we don't yet have the benchmark of a new UN mechanism. We'll get that next year, we think, but we don't have it yet, so a lot of people are thinking about how to do that on the country level, as well as the NDC target. Now, I already mentioned benefit sharing briefly, which is something that really bubbled up big time this year, I would say, in response to countries realizing now, if we have this now limited, finite asset of mitigation outcomes that we can transfer, people are starting to, and it has a consequence also for our own NDC achievement, plus we have to do all of this administrative stuff. A lot of countries are now thinking about, how can we actually benefit more on a national or maybe also local level. So you can see here the overview, how we look at that. So we distinguish between different kind of fees. What you see here, I'm hoping this is now, oh, it's not. Sorry, seeing this for the first time, so I better leave it. But you see there's different types of fees. On one hand, there's administrative fees, which countries are really just, like the Secretary does, charge to cover, their efforts, so to speak, in doing approvals and accounting and reporting and all that. That includes the corresponding adjustments. But then there are also other fees, what you see on the right hand here, like, for instance, funding for adaptation, like what we know from the share of proceeds, also on the 6.4 mechanism, which got increased compared to the Kyoto levels to 5%. But then beyond that, there are countries, Kenya is now currently the front runner here, I would say, but also some others, that are desiring to also keep a larger share of the financial benefits of these projects for local communities, maybe also for other government priorities in the sustainable development space, etc. So this is an important new development that I think is generating a lot of discussions, especially with the private sector, maybe not as much with public buyers, but still. But in particular in the private sector space, this is of course a huge issue that is at an early stage of the discussion. Now we see here the overview of support initiatives, and can you see this? No, sorry. Yes. And we see that there are a number of important capacity building programs already, and GGI is one of the leading organizations here in the space. That is very clear, and it's good to see that there is also this direct integration of not only providing technical assistance, but also really working towards practical projects that are generating transactions. I think that's really, really important to have not only, the theory, but also the practical dimension directly integrated. Overall, I still would argue, or we all as a team of authors think that capacity building is not sufficient in scale. It is clear that there is a demand by developing countries to receive capacity building, but if we look at, the historical levels of capacity building that we saw, for instance, in the Nairobi framework, which is has been an ancient history, but was only focused in quotation marks on the CDM, relatively straightforward mechanism, although it had its challenges, of course. Now what countries have to do is much more complex, and we believe that the current level of capacity building efforts, even though they may be of high quality, they are in the global picture overall clearly vastly insufficient to what countries need. And that is primarily, of course, now addressing here, the funders, the donors, so to speak, this argument, not the organizations that are providing capacity building and are doing great work, but we just need to get more resources into this space. Here you see some of those relevant programs. triple GI, also now with the very important innovation of going into the policy space. That is one thing also that we didn't see in the CDM because it wasn't eligible. It was projects and programs. Now we have programs. And I'm acknowledging Fenella is pained because we used the old logo and didn't update it. I promise we will do that. Yeah. So, apologies. But, so I hope I praised you enough already in the work that you're doing that you can forgive us.
Global Free Growth Institute.
So I think we will move very quickly to the next slide. And but what I do want to say is that, you know, our own climate finance innovators program has been pushing in a few countries really also this issue of CDM transition as a fast start for the new mechanism. And I really struggle to understand why that is not receiving more attention, because we have a lot of projects, especially in the underrepresented countries, into which a lot of effort was invested, and we don't really see that. Good. So final conclusions, and I'll get to the end of my presentation, is that most countries haven't concluded their Article 6 framework. I think that already came out quite well, but I think our big picture overview shows that many important countries are working on this with a lot of intensity, and we hope to see that over the next 1 or 2 years, more and more countries will be fully ready to participate in this new range of instruments, and then I think that will really accelerate implementation or enable implementation in the first place. Then we still see, of course, that there isn't a clear agreed way on how to establish that. Countries are choosing their own ways, which is legitimate. It is also, of course, in support to nationally determined contribution, where each country is also taking a different approach. But we also see some convergences, for instance, through using positive lists. Countries need to strike a balance between national interest and providing incentives. That is primarily now picking up at this point on benefit sharing. And yeah, I think that's one of the most important things that we want to leave you with. We do see a trend that there aren't separate frameworks for VCM in Article 6, but that some frameworks have, you know, a different way of emphasizing VCM versus Article 6 based instruments. But we do think there is an increasing convergence, and that is mirroring in those frameworks. The one maybe blind spot that we have seen is that there isn't much on regulating the interplay between Article 6 and RED+, which is of course quite controversial also, frankly, but on the national level that can sometimes be really important if you look at the scale of the mitigation potential. So I think that's something that requires further attention. This just gives you the overview of the fact sheets that we compiled, but I'll not go through the list. You know the most important instruments already. So without much further ado, I want to thank you and hand back to Sandra for moderating the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan, for giving us this really nice overview presentation of the study. And I would now like to start our panel discussion actually with the second part that you introduced on concerning the regulatory frameworks that are developing in countries. And as you've also mentioned, we see a lot of dynamic in this space, and it's actually really exciting at the moment. A lot is happening in countries adopting regulatory frameworks or starting this work, and a lot of questions are coming up how to go about that. Especially, I think, since the beginning of this year, but also picking up speed. It's been a bit of a problem for our study because where do you cut off, right? I think, yeah, even in October and this month we are seeing a lot of developments. So forgive us if not everything is up to today, including actually in relation to our first panelist, Alec Muvandika from Zambia, because there has been a very important development also in Zambia in October with the launch of the carbon market regulatory framework. So let me start by asking you, Alec, what have been some of the key decisions and the process that was followed in coming up with this carbon market framework and allowing this breakthrough. And also on a similar note, I think as other countries are now starting to engage, what would you advise them if they should start their own process?
Can I use this? Okay, thank you, Sandra. Yeah, as indicated, my name is Alik Muvundika from Zambia. In addition to being a member of the supervisory body, I also chair the Zambian DNA. Yeah, so as a country, we realized that the international carbon market would provide an opportunity for us to collaborate with other countries, but also with other international organizations as well as the private sector to help us achieve our NDC, which, by the way, is a conditional one. We've got a conditional NDC. And so, as a country, we've taken steps to operationalize our participation in Article 6. And so the first thing that we did was to come up with a comprehensive carbon market framework with the help of GGI under the SPARK program, very, very detailed. And this was launched in October. So this basically replaced what we had initially. We had the interim guidelines. So with the adoption of the carbon market framework, that replaced the interim guidelines. So as the name suggests, as I indicated, it's a detailed document that actually guides potential project participants on what they should follow when coming to invest in carbon projects in Zambia. But it also gives a guide to us as a DNA in terms of what to look for when we receive either an application for a letter of approval or an MIDDA. So it's very, very detailed. It's online. You can Google it and have access to it. But to answer your question in terms of what steps, we lack as a country because we had some legacy institutions from the CDM. We had a DNA under the CDM, which basically, has taken over the role, of the things that are required under Article 6. So we've added a few institutions on the DNA, and we've communicated to the UNF Secretariat that this is a DNA under 6.4. So in terms of, that's one thing which we did. We had to set up a DNA because that's a requirement for you to participate under Article 6. But more importantly, when we're developing the carbon market framework, the steps that or the process that we used, we had to do extensive awareness and consultations with the relevant key stakeholders, and these included the private sector. We also brought on board the banking community. We had very, very good feedback. So what is in the framework actually has buy-in from the key stakeholders. And it was very, very interesting during the awareness meetings, the feedback that we got. And one feedback which, Stefan highlighted points to the issue of the capacity. A lot of, organizations that we had awareness with indicated that the carbon market actually is not as easy as it sounds. It's quite complicated. It's too technical. And so they begged us to, make it much simpler. And in fact, my minister, makes me, makes fun of me that whenever I listen to your presentation, I get more confused, on this topic. You confuse me more, So I think that's a good, feedback that we got. We need to make it, understandable. I don't know how to do it. It's difficult because you can't run away from the nomenclature that we use, in the market. And so they indicated that we needed to help them, with the capacity building, which Stefan, highlighted. So I think for now, those are the steps that we had to put in a DNA in place, and then had, broad consultations with all the relevant stakeholders.
Thank you so much, Alec. That's I think that's really practical, and the way you describe it, I think we are all there with you. We understand very well the problems. Let me now turn to Fenella. Also on this point, as a provider of capacity building. So what sort of main support needs are countries actually approaching you for? And the same question as to Alex, what would you advise them to how to go about developing their Article 6 strategies and frameworks?
Sure, thank you very much, Sandra, and thank you for inviting me to join the panel today. A great success in Zambia in October, but I think, let me just bust a few myths initially. We don't do capacity building. We don't do death by PowerPoint. Doesn't work. Nobody is going to become any the wiser from that. You have to be on the ground every day, speaking to everyone in the ministry, supporting them constantly. We have in the audience here Ivan from our team, who is based in Colombia, in Bogota, in the government, advising them. We have lawyers working with him who are helping the government to write the decrees with all the relevant safeguards which are essential for countries with high red content. So we have stopped calling it capacity building. We call it knowledge sharing. But you've got to split this into two areas. Firstly, what do you do with the government? And as Alec has very well described, it's got to be owned by the government, a strategy, a framework, whatever it is. So to give you an idea, an example of what we actually did in Zambia was every step of that framework, we were standing in the room, we explained what it was, we said what the options were for the government to take, we explained what the repercussions would be for each option, then we left the room and the government decided which option they wanted to go with. So by the time you've written a framework, it's not we've come from another country, written a framework, and this is how you should do it. It's a framework that's been written by the government. So that's a huge difference. So that's why the countries want to know, what's everyone else doing? We want to, but Zambia's looking at this. What did Thailand do? What's Cambodia doing? What's Colombia doing? And that's where our work, we've been able to help countries explain this is what everyone else is doing. So that's very relevant when it comes to if you're looking at fee structures, or you're looking at legal structures, or you're looking at other areas of framework setup. We did a session in Bonn in June where we had a group of people from Zambia, a group from Colombia, a group from Pakistan and Thailand, all at different stages, but they were talking to each other. And the big thing for us is it wasn't regional. Normally these things are always done regionally, and with COVID they're normally all done remotely. So this was physically getting groups from 4 countries in the room for 3 days, and one of those days we invited 6 sovereign buyers into the room. That was amusing. I must admit, that was when Colombia said, no, we're only ever going to sell gourmet credits, so you better be ready to pay up. So what are we being asked for? You'll see plenty of reports out in the world that say, we're being asked for capacity building. That's because no one ever turns down capacity building. It's kind of like, well, if you want to offer it, fine. But really what they want is, really what they're asking for, and what we find when we're sat in a country, is knowledge sharing, deep technical knowledge and assistance on exactly what does it mean when I pre-authorize, I approve, what is approval, where is it? Can I authorize before issuance? Because that recent presentation from the UNFCCC RCC said, no, it's got to be issued. Okay, then how do I give my private sector transparency and security that they can go ahead and proceed with their project? So I would say the decrees and laws, definitely the strategy, but the strategy you need to understand what's their NDC, what do they need to do themselves, what's possible in a country, and then have a strategy that is clear, transparent, publicly available to give clear signal to the private sector. Processes and procedures, you need that, because if you're a buyer, you want to make sure that there's good, clear, transparent governance. that the country is going to do what they say they're going to do, and they're going to apply the corresponding adjustment if it's the NITMO. They're going to honour what we said. Now, no country doesn't want to, but some countries, you run out of people to do the processes. You run out of space. I mean, I remember in the CDM, I think we ended up from bank having to buy a printer for one country because they couldn't print off the letter of host country letter of approval. So there's real capacity. That's why there's a fee structure being built in to Article 6 trades, to make sure that the governments can do these processes so that you have more, if you're buying, you buy something that's more robust. VCM and the tying up with VCM and the tying up with RED, that is a really important point. But I would say, kind of can't do everything at once. So I will admit we've maybe left a little bit and said maybe if they sort the rules out a bit clearer over there, then we can incorporate it over here. It's quite tricky. But certainly countries want to be able to oversee everything, and the reason they want to oversee everything is because it has an impact on price. Just imagine if you are a buyer, a corporate buyer, let's say, whatever it is, you go and you look at a country and the prevailing price is, I don't know, $25 for whatever kind of credit you want to buy. And they have a robust system in place. Great, you buy, then front page of The Guardian comes out and they say, terrible, really bad, the baselines were never set properly, not sustainable development, no benefit sharing, etc., etc. And next project gets offered from that same country. So we're going to pay $25? And by the way, that government, because they didn't govern the VCM, didn't know anything about that project. So there's a reason for governments to have oversight of voluntary markets. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That's fascinating, and I already think we need a second study now. Let me turn to our last panelist, Vicky Janssens from the Click Foundation. And I think you're experiencing this issue from the other side as a buyer and a project developer. So to you also the questions, what do you see basically as the main challenges that countries are facing in implementing Article 6 and the countries that you're engaging with?
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. Thank you to the organizers for inviting us also. It's an honor to be here. So I think the challenges that countries are facing for implementation, the study highlights many of them, and then we see similar things, but yeah, as you said, the perspective can be a bit different. Setting up all those frameworks, institutional arrangement, etc., we see that it's not an easy thing because it's new, of course, so that takes time. It's building from scratch, often, because CDM, of course, some countries have CDM experiences, but the engagement, I think, from the host country was quite different. Here, we really need host countries that are active, that are proactive. They need to know what they want because, so for NDC, for example, they have to be able to tell us what they want in a positive list or a negative list, etc., like what also your study was showing, and all these things take time. Then we have also, one of the challenges is ministries of environment are often the key ministries, but it's also very important to have inter-ministerial coordination so that you have other ministries that are involved that can share about their interests, what they think should be good also for the country, how Article 6 can be used. And then also, of course, for the buying of these other ministries in the end when they authorize the different projects. And it's for us, we really took it as a learning by doing approach. It's clear that all those frameworks to be the most ready as possible, it's crucial. But at the same time, if we were waiting that every country had all of these set up, we would have never started. And Switzerland, with its partner countries, decided to pioneer some activities in different countries. By the way, it's not just CLIC. I think UNDP is also an important implementing partner from Switzerland. They had the first authorization also in Ghana. And so we would say it's important to jump in, to take that step, and then we can also work together on these different approaches, and then continue with the knowledge sharing, not to say capacity building, in parallel. And this is actually where Thailand is an interesting example, because when the Swiss government and Thai government started to discuss, very quickly Thailand said, whoa, but this Article 6, so technical. I totally agree. What does it mean? We need a project to understand what it means. And then so we started discussing about, at that time I was working for the Swiss embassy, so I had another hat. And we were discussing about e-motorbike, for example. And then for a long time it didn't take off. And suddenly we came up with the e-bus project, and they said, oh, this is exactly something that could be useful for our country, because EV is clearly a priority for the country, but we're putting subsidies in individual passenger car, actually also in e-motorbikes and e-vans, but the e-bus, especially from the one owned by the private sector in Bangkok, this is not something that we can do on our own. So then we had the right example that the government really wanted, and then we developed the program at the same time as they were negotiating the bilateral agreement between the two governments. And so they had a reference the whole time where they could always go back and say, oh, no, well, we want this exactly from that project, and make sure that it's adapted with the framework. So that's also an interesting way of moving ahead, hand in hand.
Thank you very much, and I think we are all extremely grateful for the CLIC Foundation to play this role, right, and to jump in first. And I think even before the rule book was even adopted, that you already did this heavy lifting. So, and certainly much needed to make this very technical process more understandable. Let me now turn again to Alec with a second question. And I think this follows from what we started discussing also as one of the very thorny issues or difficult issues to grapple with, but which becomes more and more important as these frameworks are being set up, and that is benefit sharing. And I think here Zambia also has a lot of experience to share, and has spent a lot of time thinking around how this could be addressed. So we'd be curious to learn from you. So how do you plan to address benefit sharing? And do you expect there to be any clear regulations in this regard in the near term?
Well, thank you, Sandra. This has been a headache to us, especially for RED Plus projects under the VCM. Developers would go to the chief, give them something, and then leave a bit to the community, and then some chiefs would still want to eat into the share of the community. So really that has been a headache. And so what we plan to do is, in fact, the carbon market framework also now requires NPP who submits an MADD to submit also with it a benefit sharing plan. So that is still subjective. We hope to come up with regulations that will actually specify how that will be done once our climate bill is out, hopefully in the first quarter of the year. We'll have specifics on that aspect. But as things stand now, we just require a PP to submit a plan on how the sharing is going to be done, without really being prescriptive. because we don't have the regulations at the moment. And in fact, you know, we had a few requests for VCM projects wanting to transfer ITMOs, and the buying countries would want letters of approval from us. So we're still stuck because we don't have a law in place right now that could say, okay, you know, for each ITMO that gets transferred, how much are you going to, be charged? We can't do that because we don't have the legal mandate to do that. We are hoping by the end of the quarter next year, that will be in place.
Thank you very much. That's really interesting. So we have not too much time left, and I would like to give them opportunity to the audience to at least raise one or two questions. But I also have one follow-up question to Fenella and Vicky, so I'd ask you to please be concise. So first to Fenella, I think with all of your experience in capacity building that you also shared, just wondering whether any of the findings that were presented by Stefan on the study, whether they make sense to you or whether you have some different observations to share. We'd be really curious to hear your opinion.
Big question, short time. I shall speak in code. Right, you mentioned slow progress. Yes, but as you heard from Alec, in a government, sometimes you cannot do things until the regulation or the law is in place. Other places you can work in an interim. Other countries, they've already got enough in place to be able to move forward. So yes, that's a blocker because it takes a long time to put laws in place. Rules aren't finalised, another reason. How the heck do we write a very, very precise operational manual when the rules aren't clear? What do we tell them about revocation in the manual? So that's another reason perhaps it's been a little bit slow. Demand supply, really interesting. You're talking here about there's not enough supply, there's not enough demand, we need more demand. Whereas every person I'm talking to who I work with in host countries is saying demand's not the problem, supply is. It's the pipeline, it's making sure that we've got enough pipeline to satisfy the demand that's coming. Yes, you probably need to do another report now. Sorry, it keeps moving really, really quickly. So, for example, we signed in the last month 3 MOUs with 3 countries and the government of Norway that is not NEFCO, that is the Ministry of Climate and Environment on policy approaches. Big issue for us is evening up the playing field. I was delighted and very flattered, thank you very much, that the report used our survey that we did a couple of years ago about how countries feel about being proposed sellers coming into the market and what do they fear. And their view was, we're not ready because we don't have enough knowledge and enough technical experience, but also it's not a level playing field. So I can say now, and it has taken a bit of time, that we are going to be launching in 2024, GGGI will be launching the Carbon Transaction Facility, and you were talking about a lack of finance, and I think the finance takes a bit of time to organise the money, I will say. But the aim of the Carbon Transaction Facility is to have 500 million in ITMO purchasing funding through a series of donor trust funds. So these are sovereign buyers of ITMOs, and GGGI will be the trustee of those. And also 50 million in readiness funding of technical assistance. So we hope that will be funding hopefully by 2027, but we will have the first tranche of that ready by June next year. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Really, really interesting. And to follow up on with Vicky on the projects that you are implementing. So where do you see actually which kind of categories of projects are faring better in generating mitigation outcomes? And do you also see possibilities of supporting the more high-hanging fruit with today's prices, or those that might need a higher price to come to fruition?
Thank you. So we have those flyers that you might have seen, where inside we have about, I think, 10 different sectors that we suggest to project developers, to companies, etc., to work on. These are the ones that are based from, we know the eligibility criteria from the Swiss government, based on the Swiss CO2 law. But then, of course, it depends of each country, because like it could be just one or two sectors. We cannot engage in forestry, for example. Lots of countries. It's an important part. So it really depends. But in the pipeline that we have now, I was checking with my colleagues just before, I think we have quite a few projects on e-mobility, on green cooling. We see that is something very interesting. Cook stove, of course, always something also. But we also looking at waste, and I think this in the higher hanging fruit, maybe not in terms of price, but the challenges to implement a project related to waste management, all the different actors that are there. It's not really something profitable also, so this we would really be happy if we can do more. E-mobility, it always depends the type of vehicles. We see lots of subsidies for smaller EV, but not for the heavy duty vehicles or for the bigger ones. I mean, this is really where in Thailand it worked. We saw the additionality for the e-buses owned by the private sector, but we're happy to look at also other, and it wouldn't work in some other countries where e-buses are already there and they get the subsidies from public sector. So again, really depends each country, but we could look also at, we're looking actually at e-trucks also, for example, for private sector in other countries. So there are different things, but we're very open about the sectors that we can work on if we have clarity from the host country government.
Thank you so much. Now, are there any burning questions at this point? Because I think we have half a minute left, but I see the Okay, let me take two, and please be concise in your question.
Thank you. My name is Sanda from the Sri Lankan delegation. My question is to Alec and maybe Fenella about how Article 6 is being used as a tool towards Zambia's national interest, and I'm speaking specifically to their domestic debt, addressing that topic, as well as access to international capital markets. Is there anything that you're considering to include within the Article 6 framework nationally to address these topics? You know, we had a discussion here on carbon banks recently at this pavilion. So are you addressing any innovative policy approaches to tackle Zambia's debt specifically?
Thank you. And the gentleman?
Thank you, Julian Hill from Go-To Origination. Thanks for this insightful panel. I wanted to ask you about how do you deal with private lands regarding ITMOs and with the nesting? How do you deal with that? Thank you.
Okay. Let's see if any of our panelists have a quick response to that. Alec?
Oh yeah, the first question. Yes, indeed. In fact, our Minister of Finance is been on us because he keeps saying that, you know, you guys need also to be contributed to the national treasury. So the area you finish, you know, these rules, you know, of yours at the international level, the better, because he wants to be getting something out of each, you know, ton of, you know, carbon credit that goes out. But we can't do that, as I said, before we put our house in order, before we have a climate bill in place, before we have regulations. So definitely, you know, we are hoping to have the, you know, carbon market also contribute to our treasury, you know, economic development through you know, a bit of some charges. But not only that, you know, also to the SD, you know, the benefits that accrue on the ground, you know, when the projects are being implemented.
I'll talk generically about when we're looking at frameworks. Just, is it in the national interest? Yes, but think about how you come up with what the strategy is. And the strategy is the NDC. Where does the NDC come from? It is, this is what I'm going to do by myself in the country, and then conditionally, this is what I need help to do. Why do I want to do that? Because that's in my national economic planning. And it's the green bit. So it's effectively greening your economic planning. So that goes in your NDC. So effectively, if all the stars are aligned, your conditional NDC is funding your national strategy. Then you baseline that to net zero goals instead of business as usual or just the unconditional NDC. So you have very robust baseline. And then your carbon finance comes in, and your Ministry of Finance is happy because it works in parallel to climate finance and debt, and is a commodity trade paid on a delivery basis, and it's not debt. So it makes your Ministry of Finance a bit happier. Okay.
This was a wonderful closing statement. Thank you so much. I thank you all for joining us today. Apologies if not all your questions could have been answered, but I think you can take them offline, hopefully, and approach our panelists. And let me just give a great thanks to our panelists today for this their wonderful contributions.